We are live. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, perfect. Then I will go ahead and let people in right now. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our virtual space for this tour this morning. I'm going to give a couple more minutes to see if anyone else joins us, but otherwise, welcome, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, it looks like we can go ahead and get started. Welcome if you are joining us here over Zoom, and also welcome to you if you are joining us here over Facebook. We're so happy to have you join us this morning for this very special tour with the Timken. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you are with us here in Zoom, if you could kindly keep yourselves muted throughout our presentation, that way there's no background noise or anything like that. If you do have a question, you can either keep it in your mind and unmute yourself at the end if you would like to share at that point, or you can use the chat function. There should be a little button down at the very bottom of your screen that says chat, and you can go ahead and hit that and place your question in the chat box, and we'd be happy to address that at the end. If you're joining us via Facebook, you can basically do the same. You can use the chat function, or not the chat function, the comment section on Facebook, and drop your questions there, and we'll be monitoring that as well, and we'd be happy to answer all of those questions at the end. Otherwise, though, we can go ahead and get started. This morning, we are led by Dr. Florence Gillman. She is one of our lovely docents at the Timken, but she's also a professor of Biblical Studies at the University of San Diego. So we're so excited to have her joining us. And she's going to be talking about St. Francis of Assisi. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to her, and she will go ahead and get started.
So thank you, Samantha, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and very early good morning to those of you that I know are zooming in from Hawaii. So I wish I could see all of your faces at once, and I look forward to the days we go back to in-person interactions, because being a teacher, I like to see people's faces, and I can only see part of you at a time here. But anyway, welcome. And I think this subject will be very interesting. I find it pretty interesting. If you have wandered around art museums, such as the Timken and so on, you may have noticed that there are figures in paintings who are anachronistic. In other words, they don't fit the chronology of what the subject of the painting is. And at the Timken, among other people who fit that category, is St. Francis. St. Francis appears in paintings where you might say historically he doesn't belong. And that's kind of interesting, because it raises the question of, well, so why is he in that painting? So I'm going to especially work with 3 paintings from the Timken where we see Francis, and I will come back to them off and on throughout the presentation. We're also going to survey a huge amount of Franciscan art, from other places, especially Assisi in Italy, where Francis was born and spent most of his life. So right here on the title page, you see the famous St. Francis in Meditation by Zurbarán, which is a truly wonderful treasure of the Timken. And keep this in mind because we will come back to it quite a few times. So St. Francis in art is a pretty interesting subject. So as I already said, he's a minor figure, a major figure, the major figure in the work we just saw, and a minor figure in various other Timken artworks. In the world of art in general, Francis has an enormous presence. Many people painted aspects of his life and I guess you could say his adventures. The normal explanation for why St. Francis is in so many paintings, especially why he's in the anachronistic ones, is that these were commissioned by Franciscan churches or residences, usually called conventos in English, convents. And so the patrons, because they were Franciscans, wanted Francis in the pictures. And that's the logical and correct explanation for why he's in many paintings. But that isn't the deepest explanation in the sense that, so why are there so many of these paintings that have been commissioned that he's in? And that's a question I would like to deal with in this presentation. And it has to do with how widespread Franciscanism became. So I guess you could say this is the underlying question of the remarks I want to make. How did this unassuming late 12th, early 13th century figure become so influential? What was going on? Okay, so here is a Timken treasure, the Trinity and the Crucifixion with scenes from the life of Christ by Luca de Tome, a Sienese artist famous for painting altar backdrops. And this one from 1355 is a very theological triptych. By that I mean it's designed to teach people basic concepts of Christianity. So for example, you see in what's called a mandorla here, this shape, you see the Trinity, and you see that they are all equal in height. Okay, so nobody's more important than the other. And you see that the middle figure is right above the crucifix. Probably the middle figure represents, I guess you could argue whether it represents God the Father or the Son, but it is obviously lined up with the crucifixion and up here to the resurrection. So this is a major theological concept of Christianity, the Trinity. And you see that as far as the life of Jesus goes, which is what is represented in the rest of the pictures, there's the Mother Mary who's receiving the announcement from the angel over here that she will be the mother of Jesus. And here you see scenes from the life of Jesus on the left, the birth of Jesus, and the visit of the shepherds and so on. And over here, scenes from the crucifixion. So you have the basic message about Jesus right here in one triptych. And notice that down here you have the women at the cross, but there's Francis. Francis is anachronistic. He doesn't belong in this scene, but he is. By the way, he's recognizable by his brown habit, his brown clothing, and the rope around his waist. So brown with a rope around the waist are some of the attributes, the artistic attributes of Francis, but he doesn't belong here. but he is here. And that is very likely because some Franciscan group commissioned this painting and they want him there to represent their founder, the person who influences them. It also reflects that Francis himself was very, very taken with the crucifixion of Jesus and spent a lot of time in meditation upon it. Okay, I would call your attention to the size of this painting. It's approximately 22 by 21. That's not very big. And it folds as a triptych. It has hinges behind. You can't see them here and here. So you could fold this up and you could carry it around with you or take it from place to place. It's relatively portable. So designed as the backdrop for an altar, it's for a small altar in a house, maybe in a small chapel. But as we will talk about later on, the Franciscans were moving around. This would be very nice to take with you if you're a Franciscan preaching and you wanted a visual aid to use to teach people. There's another triptych at the Timken, which also has Francis in it. Again, right here, you can see him. This one has more anachronistic figures. It also has St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Christopher, about whom we aren't going to talk here. But this is just to point out, we have another triptych with Francis that was very likely commissioned by Franciscans. And again, looking at the size, 25, approximately 26 inches by 21. Again, it's very portable. So I think we've established anyway what the types of pictures are where you see Francis. So either a major picture of Francis, such as the Zurbarán, or pictures with lots of events in them. And Francis is inserted most likely because Franciscans commissioned this. So back to Zurbarán. I would call your attention to how Francis is clothed in the brown habit. Zurbarán was an expert at painting fabrics. And what you see in his brilliant technique of chiaroscuro, the contrast between light and darkness, okay, is also that this fabric has beautiful texture. Notice the hood that Francis is wearing. We will come back to that later in my remarks. But also notice that this picture is very serious. And that will be an important point that we will make later on as well. Francis, his eyes are cast to the left. Notice he's not looking directly at the observer. He's not challenging the observer with a direct look, saying dialogue with me. He's looking to the left. He may even be looking past this skull, which he's holding. The skull is what's called in Latin a memento mori, a reminder of death. It's the type of thing a monk would meditate upon. They might have such a skull or a little plaster skull such as that on their desk to remind them of how fleeting life is. Anyway, Francis in this picture is really, really intent in apparently meditating. And it is that dialogues with the viewer. So we will come back to this again, but let's notice also that we are very lucky here in San Diego that there is a second Zurbarán in the San Diego Museum of Art. And this painting of Francis, you notice he looks quite different. You notice that Zurbarán, by the way, this is like some 20 some years after. This is the earlier one, and this is the one of the later ones. Zurbarán painted Francis about 34 times, and the paintings are different. Now they were commissioned, and we'll come back to that too. They were commissioned for Franciscan conventos mainly, And, but here we see within Zurbarán's painting of Francis, there are variations. And, but here you can see the attribute of the three knotted of the cord. Francis wore a rope and with three knots that represented the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And here you see that he's using the skull as a book holder, but of course it's there in the picture. So I would like to tell you some things about the life of Francis. We can't survey his whole life. And one way to explain to you how complicated his life is and how much there is to say is to look at this painting from Santa Croce in Firenze, Italy, in Florence. And notice that this artist, the master of the Bardi of San Francisco, I don't know his real name. Notice that he's painted about 20 scenes here for the life of Francis. So that would be an outline for a talk that would survey his whole life. And I don't have the time frame to do that. But the picture itself shows you how much there is to say about this amazingly interesting historical figure. Again, you see the attribute of the rope. But here you see another attribute of Francis, how we know it's him and so on. And that is because you notice the marks in his hands and on his feet, because Francis had experienced the spiritual imprint, you might say, of what's called the stigmata, the actual marks of the crucifixion of Jesus in his body. So that is a subject for certainly spiritual psychology. And while we won't go into that today, it is also an attribute, also helps us recognize Francis. Well, Francis was a man of the late 12th and early 13th century. Here are the dates. He was born in the region of Italy called Umbria, which is a very hilly, beautiful region. His father, Pietro Bernardone, was a silk merchant and very well off. His mother, Pica, was of French nobility, and Francis grew up speaking both French and Italian. Maybe he spoke French first because his father had been away when he was born and came back, and maybe Francis had already been speaking French with his mother, and therefore his father changed his name, which had been Giovanni, to Francisco. So you can almost see how that happened. The little Frenchman is so dubbed by his father. Well, I put a map here just to remind us where Umbria is. I highlighted the section of Italy where Umbria is. And let me tell you a little bit more about his life. So growing up, he had the life of a very well-off person. They weren't the richest people in the town, but they were very well off, so that Francis lacked for nothing. He had wonderful clothes. He had the freedom. While he worked for his father, he also had the freedom to do lots of things with his friends. So he was known as one of the, one of the popular people in his town, certainly into all kinds of things later he would regret. So as he matured, there was a terrible conflict between two of the Umbrian cities, Assisi and Perugia. And there was a battle, the Battle of Collestrata. Francis had joined as a soldier on the side of Assisi. The people of Assisi lost the battle. Francis was taken as a prisoner and jailed for a year in Perugia, and did not return to Assisi until 1204. He was quite sick when he returned, probably had contracted TB already in the prison. And he came back quite disillusioned with the war, with the issues and with himself. And he looked back on his life as he felt a lot of regret. So one thing people would do in the Middle Ages was, if you wanted to make up for your past life, you would often be recommended to go on a pilgrimage. And the idea was this was a way to heal yourself. And it was a way to do something hard, go to some important place related to saints and pray for forgiveness. And this was a form of healing. It's kind of interesting. When the pandemic started, John and I planned to go to walk on the Camino de Santiago in Spain, which is one of the most famous pilgrimage places today. And a lot of people write books about their experience on that Camino and write about how it's changed them. And it isn't always a religious change, but there's something about pilgrimage that makes people reflective and reassess themselves. And maybe it's the freedom of all you got to do every day is walk. And anyway, modern people are still doing something of the same thing. Well, so Francis went to Rome. That was a logical place to go. It wasn't terribly far. And while he was there, he was wandering around St. Peter's Square, and he met a bunch of lepers who were begging, and he joined them. Now, that was quite a big move in itself, because earlier, as kind of, to use maybe a dangerous term, but he was kind of a playboy in Assisi. I use that term to try to catch his spirit, but he had been very unfriendly to lepers earlier in his life. A lot of people were scared of lepers, of course, because they thought it was easy to contract leprosy. And if you were a leper in Francis's time, you had to carry a bell. Legally, you had to carry a bell, and you had to ring it to tell people to stay away from you. Any case, in Rome, he allies himself with the group of lepers. He stands with them and he begs with them. And he learns a lot from that. He learns what it feels like to be a beggar, what it feels like to be passed, what it feels like to receive. He probably experienced people being either gentle or patronizing. He probably experienced people telling him to get away, go away. Anyway, he really changed when it came to his attitude toward leprosy. He lost his fear of leprosy. And this became a major turning point. So from 1205 forward, he spends a lot of time in lonely places. He's meditative, he's thinking about himself. By this time, he's back in Assisi. He's looking for direction, and he's still very interested in the experience he had with the lepers, and with continuing his you could say almost his feel for them, to continue to help them. So he begins nursing lepers in lazar houses, or lazar houses, you can pronounce it either way. Lazar house is a house for lepers to live in, and it gets its name from Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke. So Lazarus is said to have terrible sores. So the assumption was that he had leprosy. By the way, the definition of leprosy in the Middle Ages and before covered a whole range of skin diseases. We are very specific about leprosy. We specifically call it Hansen's disease. We have a certain, know that there's a certain bacillus that causes leprosy. And therefore, in the modern world, we have less lepers. But it's not because there's necessarily less not because there was more leprosy in the Middle Ages, but just more things, more skin diseases got put under that category. There wasn't much differentiation. So actually there were a lot of people around called lepers. And this made for a very difficult life for them. Now, Francis, in helping them, said, quote, he did mercy to the lepers. So it meant he felt he actually made their life physically better. He fed them and he clothed them. And in exercising that mercy, he felt very happy. But he also felt like that's what God does to me. So he kind of mirrored his experience of helping lepers and perhaps feeling their humility, perhaps their gratitude. He felt like, yeah, that's a parallel to what God did to me. So this changed him quite a bit. And in the times that he's spending in the country, he's wandering around visiting various small chapels. There were lots of small chapels around the Umbrian hillsides. And one of the ones he went to, which isn't too far from the core area of Assisi, was San Damiano. And it was in very bad state. Actually, you look at this fresco that is attributed to Giotto and you see that it's in bad state. Well, that's kind of interesting because that's exactly how the chapel was too. But Giotto has also shown it's just kind of crumbling here. Okay, I would like to draw your attention to a few interesting things. So notice the structure. So it has a peaked roof here, okay? And it's very small. And notice this cross right here. So this is a Byzantine style cross. Sorry. And we're going to look at that a little bit closely in a minute. So Francis is here and he feels like the cross speaks to him. And he feels like this cross is saying to him, go and repair my house, fix this place up. You can see it's falling into ruins. Fix up my church. And let's look now at the actual place. So I called your attention to the architecture so that you can see this peak right here. You see that? So that is the original San Damiano. And then you can see it has been vastly expanded, but the original chapel is still there. And here's the entry, which you can see is centered where it would have been. And this is the cross, the San Damiano cross. So there's only a replica there now because the real San Damiano cross is in the Basilica of St. Clair in Assisi itself. So look at this cross now. This is a Byzantine cross. And it is, art historians would speak of this as an icon cross because it's got a lot going on in it, and it has a lot of other figures besides Jesus on the cross. In order to see it better, I'm splitting the image in two. So here's the, well, by the way, it's 6 feet tall. And we'll look at the top first. I split the image so we can look at it in two parts. And right in here, we have the traditional INRI above the head of Jesus. You can see it better here. INRI stands for Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Nazarenus. R is Rex and I is Judaeorum. So Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So it's Latin on a Byzantine cross. And an art historian could talk about this all day, which we're not going to do, but I want to zero in here so you can see how wonderful a piece of art this really is. So here's the lower part of it. And so this then is the cross that Francis feels speaks to him. So he starts to literally repair churches, but of course he needs some funding. And so he sold some of his father's cloth to get money to repair San Damiano. And he gave the money to the priest who was supposed to be in charge of it. And the priest probably realized it was funding from his father and he would not accept it. So he had to go beg money for the to repair the church, and he got some, and he was working on rebuilding this small building. And meanwhile, his father was getting madder and madder at his lifestyle, and he was increasingly alienated from his father. And in one public demonstration, he actually, and by the way, the bishop was present, the local bishop was present at this event, which I'll show you a artistic rendering of soon. And it's like a big confrontation. And Francis took his clothes off. He took all his clothes off. He threw his clothes at his father, and he said, "You are no longer my father. My father is heavenly." So he was given a rough garment, and he eventually ties a rope around his waist. We would probably describe his garment, of which there are some left in the museum and in Assisi. We would probably describe it as the equivalent of burlap. So let me just go to this picture first, because this picture illustrates, this picture from the National Gallery in London is a panel from an incredible altarpiece. Again, like the earlier picture I showed you, with all kinds of events of the life of Francis by Ilse Sepper. So here you see represented, Francis has taken off everything he had on, and he's by the bishop. The bishop actually, he had a lot of sympathy for him. The bishop was amazingly understanding in terms of Francis's desire to fix up the church and churches, and I guess, tried to mediate maybe between Francis and his father, but it didn't work. So his father became increasingly distant from him. Meanwhile, Francis began to realize that he had taken what he felt the cross, that Jesus had said to him from the Byzantine cross, he felt he had taken it too literally, that he wasn't supposed to fix up churches physically, but he was supposed to help the church of his time to be rebuilt. And sadly, it needed rebuilding spiritually. If you were able to listen to the presentation I made last week about Saint Anthony of the Desert, there we were talking about the beginnings of monasticism. And if you recall, we were talking about how Anthony decided to leave everything. He gave away all his wealth. He became a hermit, went out into the desert, and from him and a few other people just like him, monasticism developed. And their huge message was the simplicity of life, to get rid of your stuff and live a simple life. Don't have any more than you really need. And this was very exciting in the context, if you recall, that we were talking about when Constantine, the emperor, has become a Christian, and now it's the social thing to do to be a Christian. And now Christianity for the mass of people is just a lukewarm kind of a commitment. And monastics like Anthony are saying, no, you're supposed to do what Jesus said. You're supposed to go sell what you have, give it to the poor, and follow Jesus in your own way. Get rid of what you don't need, be free. Well, here we have Now, in the 13th century, Francis is saying the same thing. And why? Partly because that monasticism Anthony started by the 13th century and for many centuries before had become very wealthy, had become in need of tremendous reform. So monasticism itself, and that was a major driving force within European Christianity. Monasticism itself needed reform. And so here we see then, again, the method of reform is the same thing, a method of poverty, a method of simplicity, a method of free your life from stuff you don't need, which can be physical or can be not physical. So let's move on here and let's look at the trajectory of what happened to him. He started out regretting aspects of his past life. Then he found something concrete that he could do that really mattered to the lepers and mattered to him. And this enabled him to accept God's forgiveness. Psychologists, especially psychologists of religion, pastoral people, and so on, will always say the hardest thing for people who look back in their life with regrets, the hardest thing is to forgive themselves. Isn't that interesting? That this is the hardest thing. Well, this is what Francis is saying. He was able to forgive himself because he felt that by doing something for the lepers, oh, that is what God does to me. God helps me. And so forgiveness was a big part of his experience. And then he feels a lot of joy. Well, he was very surprised that some men from Assisi wanted to join him. And Bernard of Quintaville, Peter of Cataneo, Giles, these were actually people with relatively good positions. And they too saw something in him that attracted them to the kind of freedom he had. So they form a little group, and the question arose, like it does in groups that we're in. Well, so what is our purpose? What are we supposed to be doing here? Do we have an agenda? Do we have a goal? And they said, well, let's look in the Bible. Maybe we'll get an answer there. So they flipped pages in the Bible. Lots of people flip pages in the Bible, right? In desperate look for answers. You have to be careful about that. I remember my professor said, not a recommended method. What if you come to the section in the Gospels where it said, and Judas went out and hung himself? Not the best method, but anyway, it reflects that they were looking for a direction. And in this case, they found it. What they found was Mark chapter 10 that said, go sell what you have, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. And they said, yeah, that's what they were already doing. It kind of confirmed them. And they also then, as they kept flipping, opened to Luke 9, which says, take nothing for your journey. Okay, no staff, no bag, no bread, nor bread and money, and so on. And do not have 2 tunics. So they literally did this and lived this way. From Matthew, they emphasized that they had read, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and come after me. So this became their agenda, their way of life. And Francis actually wrote down what's called a rule, which is, this is us. This is how we live. And yes, you can join us. And this is how you must live to be part of us. That rule is lost. But what has not been lost is this place. So the nearby Benedictines had a chapel that was falling down near Assisi. And they told Francis, you and your little group, you can have this church. It's abandoned, it's in terrible shape. And you can have this and you can live inside it, or you can do whatever you want. So Francis and his few followers, they built some huts around this little church and they fixed it up. It's named in Italian, the Porziuncula, in English, the Porziuncula, which just meant it was a small little piece of land. The church on that small little piece of property. That's all it meant. Now, you're looking at it here and you're seeing that it's inside a huge a domed basilica. And I imagine you're already saying, hey, wait, how does this all work here? And that chapel looks that little chapel looks like it's in pretty good shape. Yes, of course, it became, of course, one of the art masterpieces of the world. It's extraordinary. What happened was that after the death of Francis, a few centuries later, the basilica was built around it. So nobody ever took it apart and took it in piece by piece. Instead, they built the whole basilica right around it. So this is it today. And when you go in the basilica, this is how it looks. So you get this sense going down the main aisle here, that you're coming to this little chapel. So this is the most important place for the Franciscans. And so it's the second of the two chapels that one has to study to understand Francis. So the first was San Damiano, and then the second is the Porziuncula. And so they live around this in huts, and this becomes headquarters. And this is always Francis's headquarters. And sometimes he would say that all his followers had to come back, and they would have a big meeting, and they would stay in the huts, or they would sit on mats. And so those meetings are called chapters, and Francis was famous for the chapter of the mats. So bring your mat. Today we would say, bring your yoga mat and sit around, and we'll have a discussion about what we're doing and who we are. So this is all very, very simple. So these followers become what are called the first order of his followers. About the same time as they're developing the first order, a woman named Claire of Assisi, from a very wealthy family, decides she too wants to be a follower, like Francis, a follower of Jesus in the same way. And so Francis has to figure out a way to establish a group of women. The story of Claire is amazing and very detailed. And as much as I would like to tell more of it, I'm not going to include it here today because she deserves a story in her own right. But anyway, her group becomes the second order, and he gives them San Damiano. So the chapel where the Byzantine cross spoke to him becomes Claire's residence with her sisters. And he eventually does found another order, a third order that is has groups for men and for women. Some are lay people and some are nuns who are more out with the people than Claire and her group were. That's another whole story, but let's just note that in 1226, Francis died just a few yards away from the Porziuncula. If you're in San Francisco and you want to have a little adventure, there's a replica of the Porziuncula there. It's kind of interesting to go to it because it's a very, very good replica. It's on a scale of 78%. You can find it at the intersection of, I forgot what the name of the street is, but you can see the Transamerica building here. It's actually right near Chinatown. And this is the replica. So here's the facade and you can go inside. So at 78%, it's a pretty good size little chapel. And yeah, it's kind of interesting to see it here until you get to Assisi someday, or if you've already been there, until you go back. So Claire, I already said quite a bit about her. Claire outlived Francis a long time. She didn't die until 1253. So she became a major source of early Franciscan historical writing about how this whole movement had started. Okay, I would like to show you here now. This is the earliest known picture we have of Francis. So Cimabue did this in 1280. And here you see Francis over here. Again, you see the attribute of the three knotted rope cord belt, and you see the stigmatic marks on his feet and on his hands. So he is not portrayed as a very tall person. In fact, he was rather average, apparently. He was tonsured, which was the tradition of the day to cut off the central hair of a religious figure. Francis was never ordained a priest. He did not want to be a priest. And while he was positive about the structure of the church, he thought, that it should be definitely needed to be reformed, but he wanted to work with it. He didn't want to destroy it, but he really wanted to change it. But he did not want to be one of the priests. So this is a detail from this. By the way, this painting is known as the Maesta. And so this part over here, this is in different light. So it looks different, but it's actually a detail of that picture so that you can see more closely how Cimabue in 1280, so only some 60 years after Francis's death, possibly knowing some of the people who had been very young when Francis was alive, may have had some verification, we could say, of how Francis really looked. Okay, Francis's followers wandered around preaching. We call these people mendicants. And this was really new in Christianity in the sense of monks were supposed to stay in their monastery, and people were supposed to come to them if they wanted to talk with them, or they wanted to go to a monastery for religious service or something. This is really different. These people are like beggars. They wander around. They just don't worry about where they're going to sleep or what they're going to eat. And in that sense, hope people will help them. So in that sense, they're sort of like beggars. They wore very rough clothing. In the beginning, quite a few, as the numbers grew, they lived in a laser house, a leprosy house, which nobody else would do. You would not live in the house of lepers because you would be afraid, even though the lepers might have gone, you would be afraid you would catch it. So their happiness kind of was what do I want to say? People caught the spirit of it. Francis's number of followers, it multiplied very quickly. I already mentioned he's not against the institutional church, but he's very serious about things need to be reformed. So he calls his brothers little brothers, lesser brothers, fratres minores. And he did get papal approval for his order. One wonders if the Pope at the time who approved the order knew what he was doing, because, you can approve something small group, sure, go ahead. You have my approval, but by 1221, Francis had about 3,000 followers, and the numbers escalated extraordinarily quickly. So he's a challenge to other monastic groups, but to wealthy people, to church leaders, and that's the external challenge. There's an internal challenge too within the Franciscans that figures into our story here, and that is how to have a group be as poor as an individual. So Francis could have nothing And, people would give him some food and give him some old cloth to wear, and he could sleep on his mat and so on. But once you have 100 people, let's say outside of Assisi, as Francis's community, well, first of all, you need some land and you need some kind of structure, and 100 people would be too much for a little village to just keep feeding all the time, every day. In other words, poverty, the radical poverty of Francis is very hard to implement as time goes on with larger and larger numbers. So there was internal conflict over especially poverty. And we'll come back to that because it's reflected, you'll actually see in the art. Now, another phenomenon of the time is that Dominic, later known as Saint Dominic, is doing something very similar. He too, Italian also, is founding a mendicant group of people. And his emphasis is that the people deserved intelligent, meaningful preaching. And so he wanted to prepare people that were well educated in the ideas of Christianity, which the regular clergy were not, okay? In this period of church history, the regular clergy were abysmally ignorant of many basic Christian ideas. So Dominic wanted to prepare people who were intelligent, who understood the ideas of Christianity, and who went out, wandered among the people and preached. So he's doing something similar. And between the two movements, okay, this is a vast reform. People call it the Franciscan Spring sometimes because it was a radical challenge to the medieval church. Saint Benedict had been the dominant influence on monasticism. I mean, what we looked at last time with Anthony and so on had grown, and eventually Benedict of Nursia had imprinted a rule that made a lot of sense and it basically guided the whole of monasticism. But his rule said that the monks in his monasteries could not wander around and could not be beggars and so on. People had to come to them. And those monasteries became wealthy because people gave them land and artworks and jewelry and so on. And so mendicants really changed things. And they were free to go wherever. They were not held back by possessions. And they, like Francis and Dominic, challenged people. You don't need as much as you have, probably. Why don't you just have what you need? So they weren't telling people don't have houses and don't have what you need for your children and your family and your business, but they were saying, can you simplify? Can you live a more simple life? This painting says a lot. This is a phenomenal statement of what was going on. This is Rubens, 1620, now in Lyon. And in this painting, which is Francis and Dominic saving the world from the wrath of Christ, okay? You see Jesus here, wrathful. His arm is raised as if he's going to send thunderbolts upon the earth. And you see God the Father here in the Spirit. So you see the Trinity here. Now, I'm not going to list all these people, but they're all positive figures. So they're all good examples of Christian beliefs. And here you see Dominic. Dominic, one of the attributes of Dominic, he's usually in a white robe. Here you see with oftentimes black over it. And here you see Francis in rough brown wool with patches and so on. So it's Francis and Dominic saving the world from the wrath of Christ. In other words, Rubens is saying, recognizing, as it was in his period, that the mendicant orders had done an enormous amount to reform Christianity and to help put it back on a more genuine track. So a very important statement artistically that Francis and Dominic are basically saying to Jesus or to the Christ, wait, don't visit your wrath upon Christianity. We are really trying. Francis died in 1226. This is the site underneath in the lower basilica of Assisi of his grave. And I'd like to bring this together by quoting the curator of the Timken, Dr. Derek Cartwright, who in more recent writing on the Timken website says this: representations of St. Francis proliferated immediately after his death and included memorable works by Cimabue and Giotto. We looked at just a few of those. And Giotto, whose stark frescoes recounting his life and miracles enliven the walls of the Basilica of San Francisco in Assisi. Notice what Derek says. If you haven't seen them, they should be high on your post-academic or post-pandemic travel to-do list. Yeah, the art related to Francis and much of it in Assisi is absolutely phenomenal. Here you see Francis receiving what's called the stigmata, the marks of Christ's crucifixion in his own body. As I said, that is a subject for another whole lecture, but that is a major issue in his life. There are other major things we didn't even touch upon, such as Francis's attempt, because he's living in the middle of the Crusades, to try to end the Crusades by visiting the Sultan, the Muslim political leader in Egypt. And he visited, but was unable to achieve the rapprochement or the end of the Crusades as he wanted, but he really tried. So back to the Timken treasures that we have, which show Francis. Why is Francis in so many paintings? There were two answers. The first, I said, yes, of course, there's so much patronage. But underneath that is a deep answer also, and that is Franciscanism had exploded across Europe and, was eventually on the boats to the New World and had moved far to Western Asia also. So why is St. Francis in so many paintings? Because there were so many Franciscans all over the place. He becomes incredibly well known. So these triptychs, the next time you see them, once the museum reopens, yes, maybe you will think of it a little differently about why he's there. Also, a last comparison between, on the left, the Timkens, Zurbarán, and the San Diego Museum of Art's Zurbarán. So both by Zurbarán. Notice the dates at the bottom. And now, what can we say? Look at how different Francis looks in these paintings. So this Francis on the left has a pointed hood, and that is the mark of Capuchin Franciscans. So the Capuchin is the cap. Okay. By the way, those monkeys in the zoo that are called cappuccino monkeys, that's because they have the same kind of little cap. Okay. So notice over here in the later Zurbarán, Francis has a different kind of hood. And this reflects the splits in the Franciscans. So Zurbarán is very sharp. He knows who has commissioned him for each of these paintings. And so he obviously, for the one on the left, commissioned this for a Capuchin group of Franciscans. And over here is not, this is not certain which group, but is not Capuchin. So these are little hints, and you see that the artist is very aware of the division among Franciscans and knows those houses, those conventos, which which ordered these paintings. Okay, he knows how they look. Why? Why does it matter that he paints a Francis that looks like the members of the group? Because these paintings are both done in what is called the Counter-Reformation. And this is a period following the huge Reformation of the 1500s, which split Christianity, Western Christianity, into Protestant groups and Roman Catholicism. This is the period after that in which the church itself is saying, we still need to reform. The Reformation sent huge messages and some reforms happened, but the church itself knew again in the 1600s it needed to reform. And Francis is again used to send a message, okay? In this case, the religious orders of Franciscans themselves by this time need to reform. They would commission these paintings to inspire their own members to don't forget what he taught us, how he lived. Don't forget the simplicity of life he urged people to take on. So what I think is interesting about Zurbarán's portrayal, though, is like I said, Francis is not looking right out at you. Francis is not making eye-to-eye contact with the observer, at least in the left, maybe a little bit in the painting on the right. He's not an in-your-face Francis. He's a Francis that you look at and say, wow, he was really, really absorbed in his relationship with God and what he was doing. And if you were in one of the conventos that had these paintings, okay, the message is pretty clear. If you're a Franciscan, are you doing this too? So anyway, we can end there. One more recent quote from Dr. Cartwright. He said, "We should not be surprised by the fascination that the Spanish Baroque painter Zurbarán demonstrated in his namesake." And he tells you these works were made for Franciscan religious orders, who commissioned them as objects of devotion. Some may have been for private individuals too. So he says also, there is an austere consistency with which the civilian artist represented the saint. The last thing about Francis is I would emphasize the growth has been incredible. Francis is always used again as a reformer. So like in the Counter-Reformation, the Franciscans are trying to reform themselves even 400 years after Francis, by Francis. In the modern world stage, it's kind of interesting to notice that the recent Pope took the name Francis, and notice it's Francis the First. Okay? Nobody since Francis died, no one as Pope has ever dared to take his name before. That's pretty interesting, because if you take his name as Francis did, you are saying I'm a reformer. Wow, that's a pretty bold thing to do. So I think this figure on the world stage is really worth watching. He, as we know, he wants to make a difference for all people of the world, all around the world, wherever he can. Look at his most recent trip to Iraq, and he's planning the South Sudan. And you don't just go to these places, for a weekend away. So he's a very daring person, but it's using Francis again. So Francis, he has a role in history as a reformer. I hope that when you look at paintings of him where he is and other paintings of just Francis, that some of these ideas will come back to you and you'll enjoy thinking about Francis. So I will stop there and take some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gillman. Virtual round of applause. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. I already see a couple of questions, so we can go ahead and jump into those. I see one from Donna in the chat asking, where was the bronze meditative statue of St. Francis taken? Do we know where that is?
Yes, I took the, it says at the bottom of the slide, in Assisi.
Oh, it's in Assisi. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and the bronze sculptor's name is right there on the page. Yes.
Perfect, thank you. And then Jane is also asking, can you say that the brown robe is St. Francis's attribute to identify him in paintings, or are there other attributes that we can kind of find him?
The brown robe, the tonsured head, the rope with the 3 knots is usually there. And then he's one of the only, maybe the only saint with the marks of the stigmata. So that's usually one of the biggest identifying attributes.
Sure, great. And I actually, this kind of goes along, I was actually wondering myself, in regards to the 3 knots, is 3, I would assume, Trinity? Is that what?
No, as I think I mentioned, they would take 3 vows. So vow to be poor, they would vow to be chaste, meaning they would not marry, and they would vow obedience to the head of the order. So yeah, that was one thing that monasticism had to learn the hard way, and that was that you can have a lot of people joining a movement, as Francis did, but you must have an agreement upon what you're doing and how you're doing it. And so obedience became a pretty interesting kind of a thing. You gotta vow obedience, or if you don't live the way we're going to live and do the things we say we're going to do, then you don't fit.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I see we do actually have a question from Facebook as well, asking, was Martin Luther a Franciscan?
They're still there.
Different order.
Yes.
Was Martin Luther a Franciscan?
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther was an Augustinian. Yes, so he was a monk, a priest, a biblical professor, and yeah, he was an Augustinian. He would, well, yeah, that's another whole subject.
Yes, I'm sure. Yes, I'm sure. Lots of information about Martin Luther as well. Great. Does anyone have any, last questions? We might be able to take one more. I see lots of thanks in the chat. So thank you again to Dr. Gillman.
I'm also looking, yeah, I see some in the chat. Thank you for your comments. Yeah, someone's saying, talk about Claire sometime. Oh, I'd love to talk about Claire. She's pretty interesting. She broke a lot of, what do I want to say, broke through a lot of restrictions for the women of her time in Assisi. And although she was also a woman of her time in the sense that she agreed that her group would not be out with the people. Okay, so they became very important for nursing, but the people had to be brought to them. So on.
Yeah, she sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear more about her. It might be the next thing that I need to look into after this. Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. It looks like we don't necessarily have any further questions. But thank you again so much, Dr. Gillman. This has been such a fascinating series. Really interesting to be able to get to know more about these saints' lives. We often only see them in paintings, so to kind of know their background is amazing. So thank you so much. Before you guys go, we do obviously, have other tours that are going on here at the Timken, virtually. So feel free to go ahead to our website and check out, what other events are coming up. We do have a tour tomorrow, and there are lots more, kind of coming up in the series. So I encourage you to go ahead and take a look. But otherwise, again, thank you so much, Dr. Gillman. It's been a pleasure. And thank you everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.